My name is Jessica, and I'm 24 years old. I have a story about the day I discovered my parents had secretly used my entire college fund to pay for my brother's extravagant wedding. What they didn't know was that I had been documenting everything, and I was about to show them exactly what their favoritism had cost our family. You won't believe how this turned out. But let me tell you, sometimes the quiet ones have the loudest victories. I need to tell you about something that happened 6 months ago that completely changed how I see my family. Growing up, I always knew my brother Michael was the golden child, but I never imagined how far my parents would go to prove it. Let me paint you a picture of our family dynamic. Michael is 28, charming, and has never held a job for more than 8 months in his entire adult life. Meanwhile, I've been working since I was 16, graduated summa cum laude from college, and landed my dream job at a marketing firm right after graduation. But somehow, in my parents' eyes, Michael could do no wrong while I was just there. The signs were always obvious if you knew where to look. When Michael crashed his car in college, Dad immediately bought him a newer, better one. When I needed a car for my job interview senior year, they told me to take the bus and build character. When Michael's girlfriend of 3 months got pregnant and they decided to get married, suddenly it became the family's top priority. I should have seen what was coming when Mom started asking weird questions about my college expenses. Jessica, honey, do you remember exactly how much we spent on your tuition? She'd ask over dinner. Are you sure the final semester was that expensive? I thought she was just being nostalgic. Maybe proud of how I'd graduated debt-free thanks to the college fund they'd been building since I was born. The college fund. God, I was so naive about that money. My grandparents had started it when I was 2 years old, and my parents had always talked about it like it was sacred. This is for Jessica's education, Dad would say whenever the subject came up. We want her to have every opportunity. I remember being 8 years old and proudly telling my teacher that I wouldn't need student loans because my family was smart about saving. What I didn't know was that while I was busting my butt to get scholarships to reduce the burden on that fund, Michael was making plans that would change everything. His fiancée Emma came from money, the kind of old family wealth that made my parents suddenly very interested in impressing the right people. When Emma's parents started talking about a proper wedding, I watched my parents' eyes light up with social climbing possibilities. The engagement party should have been my first real warning. It was held at the country club, cost more than most people's weddings, and featured an ice sculpture of Michael and Emma's initials. I remember standing there in my Target dress, watching my parents beam with pride as they mingled with Emma's family and feeling like I was watching strangers. Isn't this wonderful? Mom whispered to me as we watched Michael give a speech about finding his soulmate. The Hendersons are such an established family. This connection could really help Michael's career. I wanted to ask what career she was referring to, since Michael was currently between opportunities again, but I kept my mouth shut. That's what I always did. Keep quiet. Don't make waves. Be the responsible one. The wedding planning started immediately, and it consumed our house like a hurricane. Every conversation became about flowers, venues, caterers, and guest lists. The budget kept growing, and I noticed my parents having hushed conversations that stopped whenever I entered the room. But that was just the beginning of what would become the most eye-opening 6 months of my life. 3 months before the wedding, I was having coffee with my mom when she said something that made my blood run cold. We were discussing my plans to start graduate school in the fall, and I mentioned being grateful that I still had money left in my college fund for continuing education. Mom got this weird look on her face, like she'd swallowed something bitter. "Oh, sweetie," she said, not meeting my eyes. "We need to talk about that." The conversation that followed will be burned into my memory forever. Apparently, Michael's wedding had become more expensive than anticipated. Emma's family had certain expectations about the level of celebration, and my parents didn't want to embarrass themselves or Michael by seeming cheap. "It's just a loan," Mom insisted, as she explained how they dipped into my college fund. "We'll pay it back before you need it for grad school," Michael and Emma will help once they're settled. I sat there, stunned, as she rattled off numbers. The venue, the catering, the flowers, the photographer, the band. Each expense was bigger than the last, and each one was being funded by money that was supposed to secure my future. How much? I finally managed to ask. Well, we've used about $40,000 so far, but... $40,000? I interrupted. Mom, the entire fund was $55,000. She started talking faster, explaining how Michael really needed this, how it was important for his future, how Emma's family would think poorly of us if we couldn't provide a proper wedding. I listened to her justify giving away my entire educational future for one day of my brother's life, and something inside me broke. The worst part wasn't even the money. It was the complete lack of consideration for my feelings or my future. They hadn't asked me. They hadn't even told me until I brought it up. They'd made this massive decision that affected my life without including me in the conversation at all. What about grad school? I asked quietly. You're so smart and resourceful, Dad chimed in, having materialized during the conversation like he'd been waiting in the wings. You'll figure out scholarships and loans. You're good at that stuff. Michael isn't as academically inclined as you are. Academically inclined. That was their euphemism for the fact that I'd worked my ass off in school while Michael had partied, his way through a communications degree that took him 6 years to complete. Over the next few weeks, I watched them throw money around like it was confetti. $1,000 for specialty linens that would be used for 4 hours, $800 for centerpieces that people would barely notice, $1,500 for a cake that most guests wouldn't even eat. Each expense felt like a slap in the face, but the real gut punch came when I overheard Mom on the phone with Emma's mother. "Oh, don't worry about Jessica," she was saying. "She's the responsible one. She'll land on her feet. Michael needs more support right now." I stood in the hallway, listening to my own mother dismiss my dreams and my future like they were inconvenient details in Michael's love story. That's when I knew I couldn't just sit quietly and accept this anymore. But what I discovered next would change everything I thought I knew about my family's priorities. Wish I could say I went looking for what I found next. But the truth is, it fell into my lap in the most mundane way possible. I was helping Mom organize wedding RSVPs when I knocked over a stack of papers on the kitchen table. As I bent down to pick them up, I saw something that made my heart stop. It was a bank statement, and it wasn't just showing the depletion of my college fund. There was another account I'd never seen before, labeled Michael's Emergency Fund, and it had a balance of $37,000. My hands were shaking as I looked at the other papers scattered on the floor. Credit card statements showing wedding expenses, a loan application that had been approved for $25,000, and most devastating of all, a handwritten note in Dad's writing that said, "Jessica's fund, $55K available, should cover venue and catering." They hadn't touched Michael's emergency fund. They hadn't taken out a loan until after they'd drained my account. They had deliberately chosen to sacrifice my future while protecting Michael's safety net. I sat on that kitchen floor, surrounded by evidence of my parents' priorities, and felt something I'd never experienced before. It wasn't just hurt or anger. It was a complete shift in how I saw myself in this family. I wasn't their daughter. I was their backup plan, their safety valve, their acceptable loss. That night, I did something I'd never done before. I started taking pictures of every document I could find. Bank statements, receipts, emails between my parents about wedding expenses. I told myself I was just documenting the situation, but deep down, I think I knew I was building a case. TCL. Next morning, I called the bank to check my college fund balance myself. The customer service representative's cheerful voice felt like nails on a chalkboard as she confirmed what I already knew, $2,147 to $33. That's what was left of 13 years of savings and sacrifices. "Is there anything else I can help you with today?" she asked. Actually, yes, I heard myself saying. I need to know the exact dates and amounts of all withdrawals from this account in the past 6 months. When the detailed statement arrived, 3 days later, it told a story that was even worse than I'd imagined. The first withdrawal had happened just 2 days after Michael announced his engagement. They'd been planning this from the very beginning. But here's what really broke my heart. Scattered among the wedding expenses were smaller charges that I recognized. The fancy restaurant where they'd taken Emma's parents to dinner. The expensive champagne they'd served at the engagement party. The designer dress Mom had bought for the wedding. They weren't just using my money for Michael's wedding. They were using it to buy their way into Emma's family's social circle. I spent the next week walking around in a daze, seeing my family with completely new eyes. Every time Mom asked me to help with wedding planning, every time Dad praised Michael for finding such a wonderful girl, every time they talked about the wedding like it was the most important event in human history, I felt that stack of bank statements burning in my desk drawer. The breaking point came when Emma's mother made an offhand comment at a family dinner. "It's so wonderful that you and David are able to give Michael and Emma such a beautiful start to their marriage," she said to my parents. "Not every family can make that kind of investment in their children's happiness." Mom beamed with pride. "We believe in supporting our children's dreams," she replied. I excused myself to go to the bathroom and threw up. When I looked at myself in the mirror, I barely recognized the person staring back at me. I looked tired, defeated, smaller somehow. That's when I realized something that would change everything. I was done being the family martyr. It was time to stop being the responsible one and start being the one who demanded respect. But I wasn't going to explode or have a dramatic confrontation. I was going to do something much more effective. I was going to be strategic. The next few weeks were the most empowering of my life, even though I was still playing the role of supportive sister and dutiful daughter on the surface. Behind the scenes, I was planning something that would give my parents exactly what they'd given me, a surprise they'd never forget. First, I needed to understand the full scope of their financial situation. I started paying closer attention to conversations, mail, and documents left around the house. What I discovered was that my parents had stretched themselves incredibly thin for this wedding. They'd not only drained my college fund, but had also taken out a significant loan and were carrying a hefty balance on their credit cards. They were in deeper financial trouble than they'd let on, which explained some of their defensive behavior when I'd questioned the wedding expenses. But it didn't excuse the lies or the complete disregard for my future. I also started researching my legal options. While the money had been in an account with my parents' names on it, there was documentation proving it had been designated specifically for my education. My grandmother had kept meticulous records when she was alive, and I found old letters where my parents had explicitly promised that every dollar would go toward my schooling. But more importantly, I started documenting everything that was happening in real time. I kept a detailed journal of conversations, took photos of wedding expenses, and even started recording some discussions with my parents when they'd make particularly outrageous statements about their priorities. The most revealing conversation happened when I casually mentioned that one of my coworkers was struggling to pay for her sister's wedding. Dad immediately launched into a lecture about how family comes first and how sometimes you have to sacrifice for the people you love. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife, but I just nodded and asked thoughtful questions while my phone recorded every word. Meanwhile, I was quietly building my exit strategy. I researched apartments I could afford on my salary, looked into graduate programs that offered better financial aid packages, and even started applying for evening jobs to build up my savings account. I wasn't going to let their financial decisions trap me into continuing to live at home and accept their treatment. The wedding was 3 weeks away when I made my decision about timing. I would wait until after the reception, when they were basking in the glow of their social triumph and already committed to all the expenses. Then I would present them with a choice that would force them to confront exactly what their favoritism had cost our relationship. I spent hours crafting what I would say, practicing in the mirror, anticipating their responses. I knew they'd try to guilt me, to make me feel selfish and ungrateful. I prepared for tears, accusations, and attempts to rewrite history. But I also prepared for the possibility that they'd surprise me, that they'd actually acknowledge what they'd done and try to make it right. 2 weeks before the wedding, I had everything ready. I'd compiled all the financial documents, printed out the bank statements, and prepared a detailed breakdown of exactly how they'd prioritized Michael's wedding over my education. I'd also written out 3 different options for how they could begin to repair the damage they'd done to our relationship. But I also prepared for the nuclear option. If they refused to acknowledge their actions or tried to dismiss my concerns, I had one final card to play that would ensure they understood the consequences of taking me for granted. The wedding week arrived, and I watched my parents run around, in a state of excited panic, making last-minute adjustments and receiving praise from Emma's family for the beautiful celebration they'd planned. I helped where I was asked, smiled at the appropriate moments, and kept my thoughts to myself. The night before the wedding, Mom came into my room with tears in her eyes. "I'm so proud of the woman you've become," she said, sitting on my bed. "You've been so supportive through all of this. I know it hasn't been easy having all the attention focused on Michael lately." It was the closest she'd come to acknowledging that their behavior might have affected me, and for a moment, I almost lost my resolve. But then she continued, "After Michael and Emma are settled, we'll focus on helping you figure out your next steps. Maybe you can find a job that will pay for grad school, or we can look into those income-based loan programs." She still didn't get it. Even in her moment of recognition, she was still relegating my dreams to the back burner, still assuming I'd just figure it out on my own while they recovered from the financial hit they'd taken for Michael's perfect day. "Thanks, Mom," I said quietly. "I'm sure everything will work out exactly as it should." She kissed my forehead and left, completely unaware that she'd just sealed her fate. Tomorrow, after the last dance and the final toast, it would be time for the conversation that would change our family forever. The wedding was everything my parents had dreamed it would be. The venue was stunning, the flowers were perfect, and Emma looked like a princess in her designer gown. I watched Michael give his speech about finding his soulmate and building their future together, and I had to admire the irony. He was talking about his bright future while standing in a room paid for by destroying mine. The reception was a social triumph for my parents. I watched them glow as Emma's family praised the celebration, as guests complimented the food and the beautiful decorations. Dad even got a little teary-eyed during his father of the groom speech, talking about how proud he was to welcome Emma into the family and how happy he was to give Michael and Emma the perfect start to their journey together. I waited. I danced when asked, made small talk with relatives, and played the role of the supportive sister one last time. But as the evening wound down and the last guests were saying their goodbyes, I knew it was time. "Mom, Dad," I said as we were cleaning up the head table, "I need to talk to you both, privately." Something in my tone must have caught their attention, because they both stopped what they were doing and looked at me with sudden concern. "Is everything okay, sweetheart?" Mom asked. "Let's go somewhere quiet," I said, gesturing toward a small side room the venue used for private meetings. Once we were alone, I pulled out the folder I'd been carrying all evening and set it on the table between us. My hands were steadier than I'd expected, and my voice was calm when I began to speak. "I need you to look at these documents," I said, opening the folder to reveal the bank statements, receipts, and financial records I'd compiled. "I want you to see exactly what you've done." Dad picked up the first bank statement, and I watched his face change as he recognized what he was looking at. Mom peered over his shoulder, and her hand flew to her mouth. "Jessica, honey, we can explain," she started. "No," I interrupted, my voice still quiet but firm. "You're going to listen first, then you can explain." I walked them through it all, the systematic draining of my college fund, the existence of Michael's untouched emergency account, the timeline showing they'd planned this from the moment Michael got engaged, the total amount they'd spent on one day versus the 13 years of savings they'd sacrificed for it. $55,000, I said, letting the number hang in the air. 13 years of Christmas money, birthday money, summer job savings, and sacrifice. Gone in 6 months for flowers and fancy food that people forgot about before they even got to their cars. Dad tried to interrupt, but I held up my hand. I'm not finished. I pulled out my phone and played the recording of our conversation about family sacrifice, letting them hear their own words about how sometimes you have to give up things for the people you love. Then I showed them the research I'd done on graduate programs, the loans I'd now have to take out, the opportunities I'd have to pass up because of their decision. But here's what hurts the most, I continued, my voice finally starting to shake with emotion. It's not even the money. It's that you didn't think I was worth including in this decision. You didn't think my future was worth considering. You just decided that Michael's one perfect day was more important than my entire educational career, and you thought I'd just quietly accept it because I'm the responsible one. Mom was crying now, and Dad looked like someone had punched him in the stomach. Jessica, we never meant— Yes, you did, I said firmly. You absolutely meant to do this. You had other options. You could have taken out a larger loan. You could have had a smaller, less expensive wedding. You could have used Michael's emergency fund. But you chose the path that required the least from everyone except me. I sat back in my chair and looked at both of them. So now I'm going to give you a choice, just like you gave me a choice. Except I'm actually going to let you know what your options are instead of making the decision behind your back. I pulled out 3 printed sheets of paper and placed them on the table. Option 1. You acknowledge what you've done, and we work together to fix it. You take out a loan to restore my college fund, and we rebuild our relationship based on honesty and mutual respect. Dad picked up the first sheet, scanning the detailed repayment plan I'd outlined. Option 2. You continue to justify your actions and minimize the impact on me. In that case, I'll be moving out next weekend, and you can figure out how to explain to everyone why your responsible daughter suddenly wants nothing to do with family gatherings. Mom grabbed the second sheet, her eyes widening as she read my detailed plan for cutting contact. Option 3, I said, sliding the final sheet across the table. You refuse to take responsibility and try to make me feel guilty for being upset about this. In which case, I'll be sending copies of all these financial documents to every person who complimented you tonight on what wonderful parents you are, starting with Emma's family. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the cleanup crew in the main hall, the distant sound of Michael and Emma saying goodbye to their last guests. But in our little room, you could have heard a pin drop. Dad was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. Jessica, you can't be serious about option 3. Try me, I said, meeting his eyes. You taught me that actions have consequences. You taught me that family means making sacrifices for each other. You taught me that sometimes you have to make hard choices. I learned those lessons very well. What happened next would determine whether I still had a family or whether I'd be starting fresh on my own. The next hour was the most emotionally intense of my entire life. My parents went through what I can only describe as the 5 stages of grief. Except instead of accepting a death, they were being forced to accept the reality of their own actions. First came denial. Dad immediately started explaining how the wedding expenses had gotten out of hand and how they'd planned to replace the money before I needed it. Mom chimed in with reassurances that they'd never intended to hurt me, and how they thought I'd understand the situation. I let them talk themselves in circles for about 10 minutes before I stopped them. You're missing the point, I said calmly. Your intentions don't change the impact. You stole my future to pay for Michael's party. That's when the anger started. Dad's voice got louder as he accused me of being selfish and ungrateful. He talked about everything they'd sacrificed for me over the years. How they'd always supported my education, how I was throwing away the family over money. You're right, I said, which seemed to surprise him. You did support my education, with money that my grandparents earmarked specifically for that purpose. Money that wasn't actually yours to reallocate. Mom tried bargaining next. Maybe they could work out a payment plan. Maybe I could wait a year for grad school while they recovered financially. Maybe Michael and Emma could help pay some of it. Back once Michael found a good job. Mom, I said gently. Michael is 28 years old and has never held a job for more than 8 months. Emma comes from money and has never worked at all. What makes you think they're suddenly going to become financially responsible enough to pay back a $50,000 debt? The depression phase was the hardest to watch. Mom started crying in earnest, talking about how she'd ruined everything and how she'd lost her daughter. Dad sat quietly, staring at the financial documents spread across the table like they were evidence at a crime scene. You haven't lost me, I said softly. But you have lost the version of me that would silently accept being treated like my dreams don't matter. Finally, we reached something that looked like acceptance. Dad looked up at me with tears in his eyes and said, "What do you want us to do?" I pulled out a calculator and a legal pad. Let's start with option 1 and see if we can make it work. What followed was the most honest conversation we'd ever had about money, priorities, and family dynamics. I showed them exactly how they could restructure their finances to begin paying back my college fund. It would mean downsizing their lifestyle, taking on some debt, and possibly asking Michael and Emma to contribute something toward their own wedding expenses retroactively. Dad balked at that last part. We can't ask them to pay us back for their wedding. That would be humiliating. More humiliating than stealing from your daughter's education fund? I asked. The conversation went on for another 2 hours. We talked about why they'd always treated Michael and me differently, why they'd assumed I would just handle whatever life threw at me while protecting him from every consequence. We talked about the messages they'd sent me throughout my childhood about my worth and my place in the family hierarchy. By the time we finished, we had a concrete plan. They would take out a loan to immediately restore my college fund to its original balance. They would restructure their budget to pay off this loan over the next 3 years. And most importantly, they would attend family counseling with me to address the underlying issues that had led to this situation. But the biggest surprise came when Mom looked at me and said, "I need to apologize to you in front of Michael and Emma. They need to know what we did and what it cost you." I hadn't expected that. I'd been prepared for them to try to keep this quiet, to handle it privately within our immediate family. "Are you sure?" I asked. "They benefited from our decision," Dad said slowly. "They deserve to know the truth about how their perfect wedding was funded." The next morning, my parents called Michael and Emma and asked them to come over for a family meeting. I watched my brother's face change as Mom and Dad explained what they'd done with my college fund and what it meant for their financial future as a family. Michael's reaction surprised me. I'd expected him to be defensive or to minimize the situation. But instead, he looked genuinely shocked and upset. "You used Jessica's college money?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "All of it?" Emma, to her credit, immediately started talking about ways they could cut their honeymoon expenses and contribute to paying back the debt. It wasn't nearly enough to solve the problem, but it was something. But the real justice came in the weeks that followed, as word quietly spread through our extended family about what had happened. My parents had gotten their social triumph at the wedding, but the aftermath was much less glamorous, as relatives began to understand the true cost of Michael's perfect day. The family dynamic shifted in ways I hadn't expected. Suddenly, I wasn't the responsible one who quietly handled everything. I was the daughter who'd stood up for herself, who'd demanded to be treated with respect, who'd refused to be taken for. Granted, it felt like justice, but more than that, it felt like freedom. 6 months later, my life looks completely different than I thought it would. I'm living in my own apartment, enrolled in a graduate program that I'm paying for, with a combination of my restored college fund and a research assistantship I earned on my own merit. More importantly, I'm not angry anymore. I'm empowered. The family counseling sessions have been eye-opening for all of us. We've talked about patterns that go back generations, about how my parents' own childhoods shaped their approach to parenting, about the difference between treating children equally versus treating them fairly. It's been difficult work, but it's been worth it. My relationship with my parents is different now. Better in some ways, more complicated in others. They're learning to see me as an adult with my own needs and boundaries, rather than as the family problem solver who exists to make everyone else's life easier. I'm learning to advocate for myself in the moment, rather than quietly building resentment until it explodes. Michael and I have had some honest conversations too. He's admitted that he always knew he was the favorite, and he's acknowledged how that affected both of us. He's also stepped up in ways I didn't expect, taking on more responsibility for our parents' emotional needs instead of leaving everything to me. The most surprising change has been in how other people see me. At work, I've become more assertive about my career goals and salary expectations. In my graduate program, I speak up in classes and advocate for myself with professors. In my dating life, I've stopped accepting behavior that doesn't meet my standards just because I'm afraid of being alone. Standing up to my parents taught me something crucial. Respect isn't something you can earn through compliance and sacrifice. It's something you have to demand, and sometimes that means being willing to walk away from people who won't give it to you. I won't lie and say everything is perfect now. My parents are struggling financially with the loan payments, and there's still tension in our family dynamics. Michael and Emma's marriage is adjusting to the reality of having less financial support from our parents than they'd expected. Some relatives think I overreacted to the college fund situation and should have just worked it out quietly. But I sleep better at night knowing that I'm not the family doormat anymore. I'm not the daughter who quietly accepts whatever scraps of attention and resources are left over after everyone else's needs are met. I'm not the woman who will sacrifice her own dreams to enable other people's poor choices. The day I moved into my apartment, Mom helped me unpack boxes and set up my kitchen as we were arranging dishes in the cabinets. She stopped and looked at me with tears in her eyes. "I'm proud of you," she said quietly. "Not just for standing up to us, but for knowing you deserved better. I should have taught you that a long time ago." It wasn't a complete apology or a total transformation, but it was acknowledgement. It was a mother recognizing that her daughter had grown into a woman who wouldn't accept being treated as less than she was worth. That night, I sat in my own living room, in my own space, surrounded by furniture I'd chosen and decorations that reflected my personality, and I realized something important. The best revenge isn't making other people suffer for their choices. The best revenge is refusing to let their choices limit your own possibilities. I had demanded justice, but what I'd actually created was freedom. And that was worth more than any college fund ever could be. Looking back on everything that happened, I realized that the college fund was never really about the money. It was about respect, recognition, and being valued as an equal member of my own family. When I stood up to my parents that night after the wedding, I wasn't just fighting for $55,000. I was fighting for my right to matter. The most important lesson I learned through all of this is that you can't love people into treating you better. You can't sacrifice your way into their consideration. You can't be responsible enough, helpful enough, or quiet enough to earn the respect that should have been yours from the beginning. Sometimes the people who are supposed to love you the most are the ones who need the clearest boundaries. Sometimes, the family members who claim to have your best interests at heart are the ones most willing to sacrifice your future for their comfort. And sometimes the only way to save a relationship is to be willing to lose it. I want to know, which part of this story surprised you the most? Was it my parents' reaction when I confronted them, or the way my brother stepped up afterward? Have you ever had to stand up to family members who were taking you for granted? Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about finding your voice and demanding the respect you deserve. Trust me, you're worth fighting for.